Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this evening's virtual program brought to you by the staff of the Peters Township Public Library. Tonight, we're thrilled to be joined by Rich Condon of Civil War Pittsburgh. Rich is a public historian from Western Pennsylvania, currently living in South Carolina Lowcountry. For 9 years, he has worked with a multitude of sites and organizations, including the Battle of Franklin Trust, Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum, Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, and Flight 93 National Memorial. He is currently serving as a park ranger at Reconstruction Era National Historic Park in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Rich is the founder of Civil War Pittsburgh and contributor to the Pennsylvania and Civil War blog, which both focus on education and preservation regarding Pennsylvania's role in the American Civil War. Tonight, we will be listening to fascinating stories and seeing remarkable photographs related to Pennsylvania's role in the American Civil War, from Allegheny Arsenal to the Civil War defense in Pittsburgh. Welcome, Rich Condon.
Thank you for having me. All right. So, first off, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to the Peters Township Public Library for having me speak this evening. And, for all of you tuning in, thank you for taking the time out of your night to watch this presentation. Also, you have given me an excuse for the first time since this pandemic started to actually wear a tie. So I'm thrilled to be here. Kind of a little bit about Civil War Pittsburgh first. This is kind of a project or endeavor that started in December of 2018. Trying to promote the idea that, in a city like Pittsburgh, it's a constantly growing city. It's a very techy city now. There's a growing job industry. And growing housing. It's an expanding city, that there's a lot of history buried underneath all of that. And especially with a lot of people now moving to the Pittsburgh area, a lot of people are interested in kind of learning this local history. A lot of what you see if you go to local museums in Pittsburgh, we're a big 7 years war country, industrial country, but a lot of people haven't focused really on what happened to our city and what's at our city, what importance did it play during the American Civil War, which is really, the most divisive conflict our country has ever engaged in. And it's something that still affects us to this day. So kind of with that all being said, we'll get started. First off, what we do and what I do is, we engage in the field of public history. We all know what history is, but what's public history? Well, it's bridging the gap between academia and the general public. So basically, you have people who write books on these subjects, but there's also people that make that subject matter a little bit more palatable, a little bit more easier to understand for the general public. We raise awareness regarding structural or cultural history. If there weren't any public historians or historians in general, how do we learn about some of these important sites and the stories that accompany them? And this kind of leads us into placing importance on education and preservation. If we don't tell these stories that are associated with these sites, then the likelihood of us saving these sites it's much less likely. So that's what we do. And we have about roughly an hour or so tonight. So I'm going to share with you kind of a handful of stories from Pittsburgh's Civil War past. We'll share some stories and some sites, and also there's a story in particular I'd like to share with you about your region, kind of the Washington County area, and we'll get to that later. The first one that I want to share with you is something a lot of people are not too familiar with, and that's the Civil War defenses of Pittsburgh. And kind of backing up here, during the American Civil War, Pittsburgh is sitting not too far away from, what was considered enemy territory. Pittsburgh, if you drive today from Pittsburgh to West Virginia, what is it, about 40 minutes or so? In 1861, West Virginia was actually still part of Virginia. And, Virginia was a state that had seceded in 1861. That was considered enemy territory in 1861. So Pittsburgh, this major industrial city, is sitting within, about a 1 day's march of an army, which was taken into consideration by a lot of Pittsburghers at the time, and kind of continued throughout the war. But why would any enemy force from Southern territory be interested in the city of Pittsburgh? This map kind of helps you understand a bit why this, what was the Iron City at the time, would be a strategic location that Confederate troops would want to invade. You can see, the point there. Pittsburgh is where the Ohio River is formed. You have the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River meeting at what's called the Point, forming the Ohio and heading out west. If you think back to 1861, before highways are really a thing, major highways, rivers were the major highways. Rivers is how you're going to transport troops and goods, etc. And so you'll see a lot of campaigns throughout the Civil War kind of being based around taking certain bodies of water, rivers, and things of that sort. Also, Pittsburgh is, you have a couple manufacturing hubs here. For example, you have Allegheny Arsenal, which would be in Pittsburgh's Lawrenceville neighborhood, manufacturing ammunition and accoutrements for the Union Army. And we'll get more into that story in a bit. But you also have Fort Pitt Foundry. Fort Pitt Foundry would be across from the Heinz History Center. It actually sat in that area of the Strip District. And Fort Pitt Foundry produced, guns for the Federal Army as well. So those are a couple reasons why. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in September of 1894 actually kind of reflected on this period in Pittsburgh's history, and kind of tried to sum up, why would any army try to take a city like Pittsburgh? They said Pittsburgh's position is one that admitted of being strongly fortified, and an area enclosed that would support with comfort a very large body of troops, while at the same time, the Ohio River furnishes facilities by which the whole western country could be controlled. Had it been captured, there is but little doubt the Confederate forces would have endeavored to have held the place. The facilities it contained for manufacture of the munitions of war, its opportunities for receiving supplies from Canada, its capability of being strongly fortified, its strategical power as severing the west from the east, rendering thus very difficult the movement of troops between the two sections, would all have made it important for the Confederacy to have held it if possible, and succeeding therein caused perhaps a different ending to the Civil War. Its capability for being fortified was so great that a commission of U.S. engineers who made an examination on this point in June 1861 pronounced it the strongest position they ever knew in the country. And for anybody who has gone to, say, Mount Washington above Pittsburgh or Spring Hill above Pittsburgh, you get a really good view of the city kind of sitting in this bowl, surrounded by all these mountains and heights and hills. It would be an easy city to fortify. And that's exactly what happened in the summer of 1863, when the Union Army or U.S. government really had 37 earthen fortifications built around the city. So this kind of starts, think about the Gettysburg or Pennsylvania campaign of 1863. Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia are looking to invade the North for the second time. The first time was during the Maryland campaign the previous year. And there's mass panic that kind of is going to spread across the state of Pennsylvania. These people don't know where Lee is actually going to head. A lot of people think that he's going to head to Pittsburgh for those exact reasons I just discussed. And so they're going to try and kind of assemble an ad hoc force to defend the city of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania in general. So on June 9th, 1863, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is going to issue Orders 172. He said this is basically going to create two different departments in Pennsylvania. Eastern Pennsylvania, basically from the Johnstown area out to Philadelphia, is going to be the Department of the Susquehanna, and places around Harrisburg and even out toward Philly even are going to start constructing earthen defenses to protect those territories against a potential invasion. Western Pennsylvania, so basically Johnstown all the way out to eastern Ohio and eastern parts of what would be West Virginia as of June 20th, 1863, that's all going to be the Department of the Monongahela. And headquarters for the Department of the Mon is going to be based in Pittsburgh. And so what's going to happen here is Union forces from the Washington, D.C. area are going to be dispatched to Pennsylvania to kind of help in assisting in getting these departments set up. Basically, whatever they can spare. Knowing that Lee's army's on the move, they want to maintain as much as they can in D.C. D.C. is the most fortified city in the world at that point. But they're going to send out officers from D.C. to basically help people in Pennsylvania to construct defenses. So in Pittsburgh, you're actually going to have William T.H. Brooks sent out from D.C. to take command of the Department of the Monongahela. And so Edwin Stanton is going to write to Brooks on June 10th, and he says, "Intelligence received this evening of the enemy's designs makes it certain that you cannot be too early or too busily at work, as Pittsburgh will certainly be the point aimed at by Stuart's raid, which may daily be expected. You should frankly inform the people of Pittsburgh that they must be at work." So, think about this. Pittsburghers are nervous that Jeb Stuart, who's leading Robert E. Lee's Confederate cavalry, is creeping somewhere around the Pennsylvania border and could easily lead a Confederate force into the city of Pittsburgh. Like I said, you're not very far from the Virginia border at that point. But what happens on June 9th, 1863? There's Confederate cavalry fighting in Virginia. And, think about Robert E. Lee when he's in Gettysburg. For anybody who's seen the movie Gettysburg, there's a scene where Lee is arguing with Stuart, not knowing where he had been for the last couple of weeks, kind of moving through Virginia. Pittsburghers shared the same sentiment. They know that there's Confederate cavalry out there. They don't know where they are, and this is making them really nervous. And they know that they have to figure out some kind of defensive work system to defend against some kind of attack that could potentially come. And so they're going to start preparing. Thomas Howe, who's Assistant Adjutant General of Western Pennsylvania for this Department of the Monongahela, is going to place a call maybe about a week after the department's formed. He says, "I desire again to call upon all good citizens in Western Pennsylvania capable of bearing arms to enroll themselves immediately into military organizations and report to me for duty. If we should stay the march of the invader, we must be prepared to admonish him that we are fully organized and ready to receive him in a manner becoming freemen who cherish time-honored institutions in defense of which so many of our sons and brothers have already offered their lives a willing sacrifice. Let us emulate their glorious example and never let it be written of us that we proved recreant in the hour of danger." So, this period between June 9th and 10th and June 17th is when the department really comes together. The Department of the Monongahela, though, for William T.H. Brooks, is going to be, think of it as like a paper army. On paper, he has these numbers, an army that's supposed to defend against this Confederate attack. But really, he doesn't have full regiments of infantry or batteries of artillery or cavalry. What they're going to have is militia. This is something that Pittsburgh had, an idea that Pittsburgh had approached before, even in early 1861, where different municipalities in Pittsburgh are going to raise small militia groups. But now they're putting out this call in an emergency. So they're actually going to, in this department, call for a couple militia groups, the 54th to the 58th Pennsylvania Emergency Militia. These guys aren't really going to see any action, but they're kind of a just-in-case situation. Real quick, I just want to share with you this. As people are kind of preparing for a potential attack in Pittsburgh, words getting back and forth between some guys in the Army and people back home. And one of them I want to share with you is, it's actually an account written by a woman named Rhoda Ogden Breed. Her son, Henry A. Breed, was serving in the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry, which is a regiment recruited primarily from Western Pennsylvania, a lot of guys from Allegheny County in particular. And on June 15th, she wrote to her son, who's off in the Army, "There is a great excitement in town. A meeting had been held Tuesday evening about the rebels coming here, that they were at Chambersburg, and this morning all the factories and boundaries and works of all kinds were stopped to have their men work in fortifications. And they are now at work on Heron's Hill and out at Turtle Creek. I will send you what is in the Gazette about it. For my part, I can't feel afraid, but I think we should be prepared to give them a suitable reception." And so these people start to construct their defenses. All these businesses in Pittsburgh are going to be shut down. All the bars and pubs are going to be shut down. And for any Pittsburghers in the group, that's kind of sacrilegious. You can't do that. But it kind of shows the state of emergency they're in the summer of 1863. We can kind of relate to the situation today with the current pandemic. It's an emergency that requires the full attention of everyone in the city of Pittsburgh. And so the city is actually going to commit about 16,000 able-bodied men to constructing 37 forts around the city. So this is actually written on June 14th to Abraham Lincoln from a committee that had been assembled in the city, requesting that martial law be called in order. They said, "Sir, the undersigned committee appointed by a meeting of large number of our best citizens have been directed to respectfully ask that authority be vested in Major General Brooks, the commanding general of the Department of the Monongahela, to declare martial law forthwith. The immediate exercise of this power is deemed necessary in order to place this department in the proper state of defense." So they literally want to call everyone to building these defenses. And, think about this. Any given defense might have anywhere from 100 men to maybe 800 men working on the fort, depending on the location and the size of the fortification. As I mentioned, there are Union officers that are dispatched from the Washington defenses and sent to the Department of the Monongahela to kind of help coach these people in building these defenses. And among them, you have a guy named John Barnard, who helped construct the defenses of Washington, D.C., and also this guy, Captain William Craighill, who was an engineer from the Washington area. So in June of 63, he'd written back to Washington that the city was not supposed to be threatened by anything more serious than a raid of a few thousand cavalry or mounted infantry, accompanied by light artillery. The instructions from Washington on which we acted looked to securing the city against attack. This has been done. We are, moreover, in a condition to make a vigorous defense against an army. And so, by later in June, many of these defenses are, for the most part, going to be done. This is actually a sketch of some of the defenses that were being built around the Harrisburg region. But this is much, what it would have looked like in Pittsburgh as well. You have, all these everyday citizens picking up picks and shovels and getting to work in the hills of Pittsburgh. And you have Union officers kind of overseeing the entire operation. Now, in the 1890s, about 1894, there was actually photos taken of the defenses as well. And these are the only photos that were ever taken of the defenses. There's no wartime photographs of the defenses. And kind of an interesting tie-in, these photographs were actually taken by a guy named David Breed, who was the brother of Henry Breed, I mentioned earlier, who was off at war. David Breed was actually training to become a minister in Pittsburgh, so he had stayed home during the war. So he basically saw the construction taking place around the city. And, about 30 years later, he goes out as an amateur photographer and documents what's left of the defenses. And even to this day in Pittsburgh, if you're looking in the right place, you can still see some remnants. Now, most of them, keep in mind, are on private property. And you kind of have to know what you're looking for. And unfortunately, with the expansion of this major city, especially at the turn of the century, a lot of these earthen forts are just destroyed and taken over by public housing mostly. Now, like I mentioned, most of these forts are completed by the end of June of 1863. They're still working into early July, but when they received news that Lee's army had been beaten back at the Battle of Gettysburg, between July 1st and 3rd of 1863, they're still working on the defenses because they don't know what might happen afterward. Could Lee come back into Western Pennsylvania? They don't know. They actually wait to celebrate the 4th of July until about a week after Lee is beaten back at Gettysburg, just to be safe. They didn't want to jinx themselves. So this series of photos you see here, this is Fort McKeever above Pittsburgh's north side, or what used to be called Allegheny City. This is along Marshall Avenue. And some remnants of this fort can still be seen today. You can actually see here on the left-hand side are rifle pits that were dug by some of the Pittsburgh residents. And on the right-hand side, you can still see remnants of those same rifle pits. And kind of, thinking about, Civil War memory and what could have been in Pittsburgh. What didn't take place, thankfully. There's no, Pittsburgh battlefield. There's a Gettysburg battlefield. But this is something residents of Pittsburgh thought about even more than 30 years later, is what could have taken place here. And so in 1901, the Pittsburgh Daily Post wrote about the Fort McKeever. Up at Fort McKeever, which is near Riverview Park in Allegheny, the recent rains have filled the deep ditches surrounding the fort, and young America evidently utilizes the pools as swimming holes. It does not require a vivid imagination to picture a charge of gray-coated howling soldiers up at the long, steep slope approaching Fort McKeever, and the terrible execution the defenders could have visited upon them. At all the defenses, fancy conjures up warlike scenes with almost a shade of regret that the spots were not made historic by scenes of conflict. Now, I guess in hindsight, some of these people, glorified the idea of possible conflict taking place where, these forts were constructed by the people of Pittsburgh. They had poured their hearts into building these defenses. But at the time in the 1860s, it was a real fear. Some people might laugh about it now, but You know, imagine not having any communication with the outside world, or very limited communication, and not knowing if another force is out there trying to invade your hometown. A couple more here I'll share with you. Fort Krogan, and this is actually one that does still exist. It's above the intersection of Morningside and Stanton Avenue. It is on private property, but you can kind of get a good idea here. On the left-hand side, that's one of the 1890s photos. You can see why they built a fortification in this area. It had a really good view of the Allegheny Valley. You know, for the most part, it was cleared of all trees and brush and things like that. Today, you know, it might be a little bit harder to find. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of toward the middle of the photograph, some of the rifle pits that would be at the top of the hill as well. This is actually from the bottom part of the hill here. You can see on the right-hand side some rifle pits. On the left-hand side, it's actually a picture taken from Stanton Avenue, looking up toward Fort Krogan. Krogan is actually built on the, for any Pittsburghers out there, you've probably heard the Shenley name before. This is actually built by Shenley's father, Mary Shenley's father, William Krogan. This is the Krogan estate, hence why they named it Fort Krogan in 1863. And you know, a lot of these forts are going to be still in existence through the rest of the war, in case, you know, any Confederate force had decided again to invade the northern states. And in fact, some of these forts are never going to be manned. You know, as I mentioned, it's kind of an emergency situation. They had raised those several militia units, the 54th to the 58th Pennsylvania Militia, but those units don't really see any action. They never occupy these forts necessarily. And they figured that if they needed to, they could always drag guns up to these forts from places like Fort Pitt Foundry, or you know, dragging munitions up from Allegheny Arsenal if they needed to in a pinch. But it was never really necessary. The militia units that I mentioned, the most that they really see is later in July of '63. They'll kind of be sent out between Sandusky, Ohio, and Wheeling, West Virginia, when John Hunt Morgan's Confederate raiders are actually coming up through Kentucky into Ohio. And for anybody who's familiar with John Hunt Morgan and his raiders, those guys all end up being captured in eastern Ohio. And a lot of those guys are taken to what was known as Western Penitentiary on Pittsburgh's north side, where the National Aviary is today. Kind of moving on here, you know, I mentioned earlier one of Pittsburgh's Civil War claims to fame is Allegheny Arsenal. And, you know, for anybody who's ever been to the site in Lawrenceville of Allegheny Arsenal, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to see. You know, Lawrenceville is one of Pittsburgh's, if not Pittsburgh's, most rapidly growing neighborhood as far as residency goes and construction. But Allegheny Arsenal actually sat between Penn Avenue and the Allegheny River, and it sat between 39th and 40th Streets. It was about 30 acres, founded in 1814. The land actually belonged originally to William Foster, Stephen Foster's father. For anybody who's familiar with 19th century music, Stephen Foster was probably the most popular songwriter of the time. He was the Justin Timberlake of the 1850s. That might be a bad comparison. But Stephen Foster's father sold this land to the federal government, and on that land, the federal government is going to establish Allegheny Arsenal at the time of the War of 1812. And so Allegheny Arsenal is going to continually grow from 1814 onward. You know, it's going to produce munitions and accoutrements for the U.S. Army, you know, for the Mexican-American War, and most notoriously for the American Civil War. And after that, it sees use for the Spanish-American War, and it starts to fizzle out around World War I. Basically, before the American Civil War, before 1861, there are roughly 300 to 400 people employed here. But at the start of the Civil War, where they're calling for more munitions, they're going to hire more people. So you're going to have about 1,100 people working at Allegheny Arsenal at the time of the American Civil War. Producing about 40,000 rounds of ammunition a day. And what it's most well known for probably is the site of the largest and most devastating industrial disaster of the American Civil War, which we'll get to here in a little bit. By the way, I just want to point out the photo that I have posted here is of the Gatehouse for Allegheny Arsenal. The Gatehouse would have sat on Butler Street. The view that we have right here is actually facing toward the Allegheny River between 39th and 40th Streets. So this guy you see here is John Symington. John Symington is going to be Colonel of Ordnance at Allegheny Arsenal during the American Civil War, the first part of the American Civil War. He actually, before the American Civil War, in December of 1860, is going to gain notoriety in the community of Pittsburgh and Lawrenceville for complying with orders that were actually sent down to him by Secretary of War John B. Floyd. For anybody who is familiar with Floyd, he's a Virginian. At one point, he does serve as governor of Virginia, and Floyd has Southern sympathies. Anybody familiar with his story knows that after the war starts, he's going to resign and take a officer's commission in the Confederate Army. So in December, around Christmas of 1860, John B. Floyd actually sent an order to ship about 100 guns, large, cannons, and a couple thousand muskets to Southern forts that were being constructed. I believe it was in Louisiana and Texas in December of '61. And this, did not sit well with the community of Pittsburgh and the people around Lawrenceville, around Allegheny Arsenal. These people knew that kind of war was on the horizon, and with Floyd's Southern sympathies, they assumed he's trying to basically stock these forts, which, mind you, were barely even completed, and supply Southern troops in case of a Southern rebellion. This doesn't actually happen. In Lawrenceville, there's actually what almost became a riot. People demanded that these guns that were being taken and put on a boat on the Allegheny River be sent back to Allegheny Arsenal. And ultimately, that order is going to be rescinded, and the guns ultimately are not shipped south. They remain at Allegheny Arsenal. Shortly after is when Floyd resigns, and barely 4 months later is when the first shots of the American Civil War are fired. So that's more of a lesser-known story of Allegheny Arsenal's past. The most well-known story is what we're going to talk about here, the Allegheny Arsenal explosion in 1862. Now, for any Civil War nerds out there, September 17th, 1862 kind of is a date that sticks out in our minds as, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American military history. But what's happening, just a couple hundred miles away in Pittsburgh is something that would stick out for the Pittsburgh community for decades to come. Really one of the most devastating days in Pittsburgh's history. On September 17th, 3 explosions take place at the Allegheny Arsenal laboratories. The laboratories, for anybody who has ever been to Lawrenceville and to the Allegheny Arsenal site, the 2 laboratories sat in the what is now the baseball field behind Arsenal Middle School on Butler Street. You would never really know by looking at it now that anything devastating ever happened there. There's not really any real signage, excuse me, accessible to the public there, minus the fact that there is a plaque in Arsenal Middle School denoting the victims of this industrial accident. So September 17th, there's 3 explosions. Ultimately, 78 people are going to be killed. What happens here is, Joseph Frick, who is an employee of Allegheny Arsenal, is delivering gunpowder to the arsenals. I'm sorry, the laboratories. He is, kind of running his daily routine. It's payday at the arsenal. And Joseph Frick is making his last delivery of the day. Joseph Frick is dropping off several large 100-pound barrels of gunpowder. And as he's unloading off of his wagon at the laboratories, there's a spark that he says was caused by likely the horseshoe of one of the horses on his wagon. And it actually ignites some gunpowder leading up to the laboratories. And it immediately kills one of the workers in front of the laboratories. And it's just a chain reaction from that point on. The 2 laboratory buildings are going to be completely demolished in a matter of about 5 minutes, and also killing a lot of the people inside. There's 186 people who are working in that vicinity at the time. Most of them were female. And the reason is, in 1861, in October of 61, John Symington, Colonel of Ordnance, actually fired 200 young men from Allegheny Arsenal. Reason being, they were discovering that there was black powder scattered in front of the laboratories. That is a major hazard. They knew that if this powder lit up, it could cause some real harm. And when he's finding, cigar butts and burnt out tobacco waste, he's assuming that it's mostly young men who are smoking around this black powder. So he's going to fire 200 young men, and he replaces them with female workers. Why? Well, he figures, number one, most females probably do not use tobacco in that form. Also, he assumed that younger female workers also had, what they referred to as nimble fingers. They would have an easier time working with, packing ammunition and kind of doing this stuff in a timely manner. So all those young men that he fires, he replaces with a female workforce. And that's why, on September 17th, 1862, you're mostly seeing female victims at the site of the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. John Symington even included in his report the next day, he mentions that during this explosion, there's 125,000 rounds of small arms ammunition that go off and 175 rounds of artillery ammunition that go off. And keep in mind, like I said, this is about, at this point, 38 acres of land for the whole arsenal. The laboratory doesn't sit on a whole lot of land. Basically, what you're having is a lot of gunfire in a really small area. It's very similar to what's occurring 100 miles away at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. And so there's a lot of descriptive and graphic accounts from local citizens in Pittsburgh and newspaper reporters. Among them is an account from the Pittsburgh Evening Chronicle. They said, agonizing screams of relatives and friends upon discovering the remains of some loved one whose humble earnings contributed to their comfort. There was not a particle of clothing left on a majority of the victims, and mangled and disjointed as they were, it was impossible to identify them. The very stockings were torn from their feet, rings from their fingers, and in some instances, nothing but a headless trunk remained. Nevertheless, many were identified by their hair, by a scrap of the dress they wore, but the greatest number never can be fully recognized. There's not many faces, unfortunately, to place with the victims of the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. Not too long ago, I want to say now it's been about a year or two, the Lawrenceville Historical Society came across this photograph that you're looking at right here. And this is of Fredalina, or also known as Melinda Neckerman. She, as far as we know now, is the only person who has an identified photo who perished in the explosion at Allegheny Arsenal. She was a worker at the Arsenal. Her father was also a worker at the Arsenal. And this is pretty common. You know, a lot of the people who are employed at the Arsenal, a lot of these young women are from the community. They're from Lawrenceville, and, you know, they have familial connections to the Arsenal. You know, they probably have a father or a brother maybe that's employed there, and by proxy, they end up getting jobs there. Michael Neckerman, you know, almost half a century after the disaster, after he lost his daughter, documented what had happened to his daughter. And he'd written, "Our oldest daughter, Fredalina, who was engaged to a brave young man, saddler by trade, lost her life in the terrible explosion of the powder magazine in the Arsenal on September 17, 1862. One hand was found on which the engagement ring, by which it was identified, and was buried in Allegheny Cemetery with 74, it was actually 78, other unfortunate young ladies. Her intended, William Kerning, through grief, enlisted in the army and lost his life in battle in Virginia. That was the hardest blow that ever befell us, although there is some consolation in knowing that they both died for their country." And this is something that the people of Lawrenceville are going to grapple with for quite some time. You know, losing these people in a very sudden accident. And unfortunately, they're never going to see any kind of compensation from the U.S. government for what happened that day. With that being said, the government does furnish coffins for all the victims of the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. Real quick, I want to share with you an account from Reverend Lee, who was pastor of the Lawrenceville Presbyterian Church. He delivered a sermon about 10 days, a little more than 10 days after the disaster, and the church itself sat pretty close, in close proximity of the explosion. He said, let's see here, "The doors of the large building near the entrance to the park were closed, and the frantic girls, supposing themselves confined for certain burning, without hope of escape, pushed and trod upon each other, screaming and leaping from the windows, seeking avenues of escape, or sitting down in dumb despair. Strange that more were not mangled here. As it was, serious injuries were inflicted, and terror was added to the scene. But the central terror was the burning laboratory. Here, 156 girls were ready to resume their labors and were almost without a moment's warning wrapped in flames or violently thrown from the building. A few ran or were blown out into the yard and escaped. Some were rescued by the daring of friends, but the majority met death instantaneously, perhaps hardly knowing the cause of their death. The fire was so fierce, the sulfur so suffocating, that an instant was sufficient to extinguish all sensibility. Some were dragged from a mass of ruins who had died in each other's arms. Some were rescued who would recover. A few escaped without assistance who will die of their injuries. Some could merely mention their names or call for a priest or for water or for prayer. But all upon the ground were naked, blackened with powder, roasted, somewhat bloody, and with many the resemblance to the human form was completely lost. Nothing but masses of flesh and charred bones remaining of what such a short time before was life and beauty. In most instances, the skulls of those taken out dead were fearfully cracked. The victims lay about upon boards and shutters amidst a horror-stricken crowd, the trees above holding fragments of female attire, mournfully waving to and fro over their former owners. It may be possible that a few were entirely consumed, not a distinguishable relic being left to testify respecting their untimely end. The building was utterly consumed, and the ashes were carefully raked for every vestige of its former occupants. The calamity was so sudden, so crushing, so widespread in its results, and the horrors so varied that the large crowd which assembled seemed overwhelmed. The usual signs of sharp woe giving way to solemn remarks or the stillness of stupefaction. And so, this explosion that takes place, claims the lives of ultimately 78 people. The next day, as I mentioned, the U.S. government is going to furnish small black coffins so people can collect the remains of their loved ones and give them a proper burial. And as I mentioned, this explosion kind of is reminiscent of what's happening a couple hundred miles away at the Battle of Antietam. Kind of adding on to that, these victims are going to be buried the next day down the street at Allegheny Cemetery in a mass grave. And for anyone who's ever visited, a Civil War battlefield or a national cemetery, you probably have seen at some point a mass grave. This is very common on the battlefield as people are being hastily buried. And unfortunately, in this case, that was the fate of these victims. Now, the people who could be buried or recognized before burial, there are a few in Allegheny Cemetery who are buried in family plots, as well as St. Mary's Cemetery, which is neighboring Allegheny Cemetery for a lot of the Irish Catholic population in Lawrenceville. And actually, this is the modern marker that was erected for those who died in the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. You can still see it today in Allegheny Cemetery. There was actually a monument erected to the victims shortly after the explosion as well, but kind of moving forward in the 20th century, that was starting to deteriorate and they needed something a little bit more substantial. So this actually denotes all of the people who were killed in the explosion. You can see their names there, and also kind of describing the explosion itself. And you can see on the left-hand side of the picture on the right, that fence line, that is St. Mary's Cemetery over there. Keeping this in mind too, there are some buildings that are still standing from Allegheny Arsenal. As I mentioned, there's the laboratories. Both of those were wooden structures. They were, decimated, and they didn't rebuild anything at that site really until about the summer or later in 1863. But there are still a couple more permanent structures you can see on the Allegheny Arsenal grounds. The one that I like to point out first on the far left-hand side is a powder magazine. That's the oldest one still standing. I believe this one is from 1814. And if you go there today, this is in Arsenal Park. It's actually being repurposed as not only storage, but also a restroom. So, although it's not what we'd prefer, this is at least a way that they were able to save the building for the city. The other two buildings you see here were also part of the Allegheny Arsenal layout, but these ones are actually post-explosion structures. Kind of moving forward, something that we all think about when we think of the American Civil War is, it earned this moniker of the war of brother against brother. And so there's just one account that I wanted to kind of share with you all about the Fehrman brothers. And, I'm actually from the north side of Pittsburgh, so I'm from what used to be referred to as Allegheny City. And there's these two brothers that were from Allegheny City, the Fehrman brothers, and they actually had a funeral home in Pittsburgh's north side. Their father was actually one of the founders of Uniondale Cemetery in Pittsburgh's north side. And in 1861, this family is going to be torn apart. There's a couple brothers who are going to end up serving in the Union Army, and one in the Confederate Army. This story kind of started for me when I actually came across this letter, which you can see kind of toward the top of the slide here. I found it when I was actually working for the Battle of Franklin Trust in Franklin, Tennessee, back in 2013, I think it was. And when I researched the background of the author, using his compiled service report, which you can see on the far left side, I was kind of surprised to see that he was not from Tennessee at all. He was actually from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. And he grew up just a few streets away from where I was born in Pittsburgh's north side. So naturally, I felt the need to go out and buy this letter. And then I just started going down kind of a research rabbit hole. Why would a guy from the north side of Pittsburgh decide to enlist in a Confederate unit, and especially all the way out in Tennessee? You picture someone who might harbor those kind of sympathies joining a Virginia unit, perhaps. But anyway, William Fehrman actually worked for an uncle in Allegheny City who owned a shipping business. So he was on boats a lot, floating down the Ohio River into Western Territory. He'd spent quite a bit of time in Memphis. And so when the war breaks out in 1861, William Fehrman's going to enlist in the Confederate Army in Memphis, Tennessee. He ends up joining the 154th Tennessee Infantry, which saw quite a bit of action in the Western theater throughout the American Civil War. And, trying to figure out this guy's story, why did he join this Southern cause when, he has brothers at home who were serving in the Union Army. I came across a few accounts. For example, on January 10th in 1864, he says, "For a boy like me, away off in a strange land, far from home, kindred and friends, has need of all the sympathy he can get. I hope the time may come soon when I shall be able to meet my dear mother once more, and there shall be peace once more in our country." He's a young guy. He's 21 years old. He's kind of caught up in war fever. I'm sure he had friends in Memphis even. And with all of them enlisting in the Confederate Army, he felt the need to do so as well. He's going to be serving throughout the entire war in the Confederate Army. And in fact, he's going to come in somewhat close contact eventually with one of his brothers who had enlisted in the Union Army, a guy named John Fehrman. Fehrman was serving in Knapp's Battery, which was recruited just in the Pittsburgh area. He comes in probably a couple hundred yards of his brother at the Battle of Peachtree Creek in 1864. And he's actually going to be wounded at the Battle of Atlanta. He survives his wounds. He continued to fight for the end of the war. And eventually he's going to be captured. He takes his oath of allegiance and is sent to Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio. At what point he ends up back in Pittsburgh, I'm not quite sure. But him and his family must have made up at some point. They might have had some awkward Thanksgivings afterward, but him and his brother John end up running their father's funeral business together in Allegheny City. In fact, a couple of years ago, I got in contact with William Fehrman's grandson, who's still alive. His grandson actually was living in New England. I kind of cold called the guy, and he had no idea his grandfather was a Confederate veteran. But he did, however, have memories of his uncle, who was the Union veteran from Knapp's Battery, which is kind of surreal. You don't find many people nowadays who have that kind of connection, familial connection with a Civil War veteran. But it was just kind of interesting. It kind of really, what we try to do with Civil War Pittsburgh is, telling the human story of the Civil War. We can read about these campaigns and battles all day long, but when you put a face or a story and real feelings with these people, you understand they're going through real issues. And it's easy to kind of relate to these things today using these stories. Real quick, I want to mention John Fehrman, the other brother I mentioned. On the left-hand side is actually a wartime photo of Fehrman. This is actually when he's serving in Knapp's Battery. First, though, he served in a Pennsylvania cavalry unit from June to December of 1863. When he's discharged a couple of months later, he ends up joining Knapp's Battery. He ends up getting captured in North Carolina. And actually later on, I believe it was the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had published an article interviewing John Fehrman. The post-war period, Fehrman was involved in several fraternal organizations. For example, on Pittsburgh's north side, the Elks Lodge on Cedar Avenue. Him and his brother William were members of the Elks Lodge. But he's also a Mason, and he's also a politician in the Pittsburgh area. So, his take on the war was highly valued by the people of, especially the North Side area. He even mentions when he was confined to prison, in prison, though our fare was terrible, it wasn't much worse than the Confederates had themselves. The sanitary conditions were unspeakable, but some of us survived. And, moving into the 20th century, he's very active in veterans reunions and veterans organizations moving forward, and he passes away in the 1920s. Real quick, too, I mentioned toward the start of this talk that I'd have a little bit of local history for you all who are in the Washington County area. This is a pretty interesting story about a guy named David Atchison. For anybody who is familiar with Washington and Jefferson College, it used to be called Washington College. A lot of these young guys at the start of the war in 1861 are caught up in war fever, much like William Fehrman was, or John Fehrman was. And a lot of these guys end up enlisting in the Union Army. When Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops at the start of the war, David Atchison, who is attending, he's a junior at Washington College, ends up joining the Union Army. The first call for troops are a bunch of 3-month units. If you think back to early 1861, these guys don't really think this is going to be a long and bloody war, and unfortunately they're proven wrong. But they don't see this being a long and bloody war. They think that it's going to be over in 1, 2, 3 months. They're going to squash the rebellion very quickly. Unfortunately, it's not the case. So among those units that are raised in Pennsylvania, you have the 12th Pennsylvania Infantry, a 3-month regiment. I believe big names such as Alexander Hayes of Pittsburgh is going to serve in the 12th Pennsylvania Infantry, as well as James Childs, both guys who are going to be killed during the Civil War, Childs at Antietam and Hayes in the Wilderness in 1864. They didn't see themselves being engaged that long either, but like Hayes and like Childs, Atchison is going to re-enlist at the expiration of his 3-month service. He actually is going to recruit Company C for the 140th Pennsylvania Infantry in August of 1862. You can see Atchison in these two pictures that I posted. On the far right of the photo on the left-hand side, you can see Atchison there. George Laughlin on the far left of that photo, we'll get to in a minute. He actually ends up serving in the 155th Pennsylvania, which, as I mentioned before, is recruited primarily from the Pittsburgh area. The picture on the right, you can see Atchison again on the far right-hand side with a full beard. And so this is the point where, it's taken probably early 1863 or so. This actually comes from the 140th Pennsylvania Infantry regimental history. And you can imagine at this point, Atchison has been on the road. He's seen action at this point, and he's starting to look like this worn soldier. And that's probably how he's going to be looking as they approach the summer campaign in 1863 toward the Gettysburg campaign in July. Unfortunately, Atchison, just like James Childs and just like Alexander Hayes, is not going to survive the American Civil War. He's going to actually be killed on July 2nd, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg, while his regiment is engaged in the wheat field. For anybody who's been to Gettysburg before, and familiar with the story of the wheat field, it's a pretty bloody spot on the battlefield. There's a lot of back and forth engagement on July 2nd in particular. The 140th is going to take heavy casualties. Atchison's company in particular, goes into the battle with 72 men, and 32 of those men are going to be wounded in action. Wounded, killed, or captured in action. And actually, this account that I'm sharing here is from that guy I showed just a second ago, George McLaughlin and A.E. Lyon of the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry. They said these officers had heard of the death in battle of Sergeant, they actually meant Captain, David R. Atchison of the 140th Pennsylvania, who had been their classmate in Washington College. The officers named found the position of the regiment and evidences of the terrible fighting under Sickles in the Peach Orchard and of the losses sustained by the sight of the number of unburied bodies of the slain. They were unable, however, to find the body of their missing classmate, their search having been interrupted by the opening of the firing by the enemy, to whose lines they had unwittingly approached too closely. On a huge boulder in the Peach Orchard is carved and visible today the name David R. Atchison, 140th Pennsylvania, to mark the identical spot where this brave soldier fell. What actually happened was, he's killed in the fight at the wheat field. He's shot once, most likely mortally wounded, if not killed. And his men are dragging him from the field, a couple hundred yards back, and he's struck again by a bullet. And if he wasn't killed the first time, he was definitely dead after that. And the men buried him as best they could on the battlefield. And they kind of had a makeshift grave marker, which you can see here on the right-hand side. I actually took this photo from my friend John Banks, his Civil War blog. And they carved in a boulder DA. And later on, they eventually wrote 140 PV for 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers. And so this is where he remained for a few days until after the battle. A family member actually went to Gettysburg from Washington County to claim his body and to take it back to Washington County. And so today he's in Washington Cemetery. The 140 and PV, I believe, were added in 1868 after the war, when a veteran had returned to the battlefield and remembered his fallen friend and decided to basically, think of this as a monument. This is a monument. And this is a site where people still visit today. It's on the John Weichert property near the Rose Farm. So, if you're ever, next time you're in Gettysburg, you can stop out and see this kind of makeshift monument for David Atchison, sitting between the Rose Farm and the John Weichert Farm. I actually visited Gettysburg around the holidays. Unfortunately, it had just snowed. I tried finding this boulder myself, and I probably ended up uncovering about 10 or 15 boulders, brushing the snow off with my bare hands. Unfortunately, I did not find it, hence why I used John's picture for this presentation tonight. And kind of moving forward, I mentioned before that kind of our purpose here with Civil War Pittsburgh is promoting these stories and these sites around the city of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania in an effort to preserve these sites for future generations. So this one right here, this is actually in Pittsburgh's south side, and sits right on East Carson Street. And for anybody who might be kind of walking down the street, walking on the sidewalk, might not really know the history behind this particular building. This is actually an old GAR post, and for anybody who's not familiar with the GAR, it stands for Grand Army of the Republic. Think of it as the precursor to the VFW or American Legion. This is strictly for Union veterans. And so what I've pictured here is the building, but also on the right-hand side, you can see a big cast iron GAR across the front of the building. This is actually the meeting spot for the John W. Patterson Post 151. John Patterson was actually a Union officer who was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness, and this was named in his honor. This is an older photo that I took, but today the building, I guess, is preserved in a way because you do have there's a skate shop on the first floor, which you can see in the left-hand side photo, but also the upper floors where the post actually would have met in the post-war period. They are apartments now. I only know this because a couple of years ago when I was searching for apartments in the South Side, I came across this, and I was really tempted to rent one of these places in an old GAR post. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But this is one of those sites you can see related to Pittsburgh Civil War history within the city limits. Also, I want to point out, for anybody who is familiar with Old Temperanceville, or what is now the West End on Steuben Street, you have the old Oddfellows Hall. And this is, I believe it's an 1865 structure, so it's close to wartime. I believe it was like later in 65 it was constructed. But the Oddfellows Hall actually let the James A. Garfield Post meet there as well. The James A. Garfield Post was a post that was actually named right after the assassination of President James A. Garfield. These guys who started this post were supporters of Garfield, and they were actually getting their collective together, around the time he was assassinated, and really waited until after he passed away to name the post in his honor. The James A. Garfield Post actually would have intermingled with the Captain Thomas Espy Post in Carnegie, which if you go there today, and unfortunately I don't have any photos of it here, the GAR post at Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall is still available for the public to see. It's been restored, and honestly is probably the best representation of a Grand Army of the Republic Hall that you can see today. Just a couple more examples here of kind of Civil War related architecture or post-war related architecture you can see in Pittsburgh is the Allegheny County Soldiers Monument. This is in West Park in Pittsburgh's north side. This monument was erected to the dead of Allegheny County in the post-war period. It was a pretty early one too. This one's built in 1871. You had the likes of George Meade, who commanded the Army of the Potomac, present at the dedication of this monument. This originally sat, you can see on the far right-hand side there, on what was known as Monument Hill. So this monument was, when it was originally constructed, was built at where CCAC, or Community College of Allegheny County, main campus is now. It would have been moved in the 1930s to its present site in West Park. And unfortunately, when they moved it, they kind of changed the construction of it as well. So you can see the spire is still there, which is about 40 feet tall, but the base, the foundation of it is no longer there. But a lot of people walk past this particular site in Pittsburgh's north side and have no idea what it is. So, we always love when we can give some context to these sites. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. This is Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum. This was constructed in 1910, and it was a big undertaking put forth by Grand Army of the Republic veterans and Union League veterans. And this actually became a GAR hall in itself. This became a meeting place for many GAR posts. And when it was constructed, it wasn't just a memorial, but as I mentioned, a meeting place and also a museum. Shortly after its construction, they start to accept artifacts and memorabilia from Union veterans that are still in the collection today. And it's one of those things. It's a really cool site because it's kind of a growing memorial. Today in 2021, they don't just have Civil War relics from veterans who belonged to posts that met there. They also have stuff related to the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, etc. And so it's a growing memorial, which you don't see in a lot of places now. And finally, what can you do to help? What can we do today to help preserve these sites? Civil War Pittsburgh is working with a couple organizations in an effort to preserve memory, stories, and sites related to Pittsburgh's Civil War history. A major organization that we're working with now is Civil War Trails, based out of Virginia. If you've driven on the highway in Virginia, Tennessee, I believe North Carolina, West Virginia, Maryland, and even parts of Pennsylvania, you might have seen one of these signs pictured here on the right-hand side. Civil War Trails kind of helps interpret Civil War history in places that aren't necessarily protected or preserved. They're definitely helpful in a place like Pittsburgh that's an ever-growing community, but we can also still tell a story. A couple of sites that we're working on preserving at this point, kind of a going list here, is the Allegheny Arsenal site. Like I mentioned, there's not really much left of the arsenal itself, but it's important to tell a story of this terrible disaster that took place on September 17th, 1862. And Fort Pitt Foundry and the defenses of Pittsburgh, even places like Avery College in Pittsburgh's north side, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad, which relates directly to Pittsburgh's Civil War history. We're working with Civil War Trails to kind of get signage like this that you see here placed in Western Pennsylvania. And the way we can do that is, working with Civil War Trails, but also through Visit Pittsburgh, which is our local tourism company, promoting things to do around Pittsburgh. Basically, if you take anything from this, I'd like to encourage you to reach out to Visit Pittsburgh and kind of, if you're interested, share your enthusiasm for Pittsburgh's Civil War era history. Let them know you're interested in having places like this memorialized and having these wayside markers here in place to interpret our local history. And that's what I have for you. Let's see here. So thank you all for tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it.